adventures around?
It was, I had bought an Apple computer back in the days when, let me see, it was with a cassette player. And it was a Scott Adams Adventure was the first thing I bought.
You remember taking a shot at one?
Well, what I liked about him was that it's an interactive form of fiction. So it's kind of like reading a book or having a story told, but it's got multiple threads through which you can do it, and there's the puzzle part of it, which makes it fun. But it's different than your typical shoot 'em up, a little more stimulating mentally.
So that was with your,
What happened was, I was in my late 20s, single guy, decided to write an adventure game just as a means to learn how to handle transactions and all that sort of stuff. So I wrote something that would amuse myself and possibly a few friends. And it started off quite innocently. I wasn't intending upon creating something that would get published. But eventually it took off to the point that I thought, gee, I should, go try writing this as something that I could sell. And that's how it came into being.
Do you remember how long ago?
I had started in the spring, I think probably of spring of 81. Winter or spring, somewhere around there. And it was the initial one where I wasn't developing it for commercial sale was probably 2 or 3 months, and then developing it for commercial sale was on the order of 4 or 5 months.
Was that a case of going to rewrite this because maybe I can sell this?
No, I rewrote it, and I initially was selling it in plastic baggies with a little printed out, basically the way all software was sold back then. And I was trying to place ads, I can't remember the name of the magazines, but the whole idea of adult software or something risque with a name like Softporn was just more than the magazines were willing to handle. I think it was at an Apple Fest I met Ken Williams, and some of his people, they bought a copy or two, brought it back to their offices, and their operation ground to a halt while they played the game and solved it. And the next week I got a call saying, would you like to license this? So that's how I originally published it independently under Blue Sky Software was my company name back then.
Were you surprised?
That was and this is a story you can edit out.
Well, is it something you don't want officially known?
No, I'll leave it to your judgment. I don't know most of the people who. The local legend was, or as I was told, was they got the game and or licensed the rights to them, and Ken Williams and Larry Bain, and I'm trying to remember the other guy's name, but it was Ken and then the business ops guy for Sierra Online, and then a programmer whose wife was actually the head accountant at Online at the time. Those three couples would, get together on the weekends and so forth and so on. And Ken had a hot tub that they'd have parties at. And Ken, all the guys said, well, that's it. We're going to, have some models come up from Fresno in the hot tub and so forth and so on. And so the wives called their bluff and said, no, we'll do this ourselves. So it's Roberta Williams and Diane, who was living with Larry at the time, and I can't remember the other one's name, who actually did the hot tub shot. They had to choose who the waiter was going to be, and he came from the high-class restaurant down the road a little bit, reportedly was gay, qualification to get in the tub with the naked wives. And he actually was naked from the waist down and wearing a suit above the water.
Really?
And they had to airbrush certain things like nipples out of the way in the photos. But it was, I thought it was amusing.
Well, see, I can have this game that just promises you the world on the cover. That's what really strikes me about it. Enough that I mean, obviously I wasn't allowed to buy it.
Well, what was interesting was what ended up happening with Sierra Online was that people would buy this game in the manner that, a young lad might buy a Playboy or a Penthouse, where, get a couple car magazines, a couple fishing magazines, and I'll just throw in the Playboy here. And people would go into computer stores and buy, a couple of other online products, and I'll just get a Softporn Adventure while I'm here, which is, so they ended up having a lot of sales.
Yes, I understand it. I mean, there's different numbers thrown around, unfortunately. It's not always easy to tell with Ken which numbers are which, especially as legends start to grow, but, they paint it as there being penetration into a market of apples, 25,000.
That was my impression. I was amazed that pretty much everybody who had an apple had been exposed to it, it seemed.
Yeah, and that's what strikes me most about it, was just the fact of inspiration for those puzzles.
One thing I tell people is that a certain amount of the story is autobiographical, but I'll never admit which parts. But
Situation.
There was a combination of that. It was, obviously targeted for the young male audience, and I tried to make it risque enough to be interesting, but not so risque as to be offensive. And I think I pretty well hit that. There were some things, depending upon what phrases you used in your input, in your searches, the game would sink or rise to the same level of language. And then beyond that, to me, the value of a game at that point was that, it had to provide a few days of entertainment to have been worth it.
Did you have see, the thing is, right, you've created this piece of work that it's going to go...
No, actually, I thought that what would I say? I'm the somewhat conservative New Englander. And in fact, I know when they ported it over to Leisure Suit Larry, they sent me a copy for review before it got published, and the only comment that I had was there were some spots in it which really had some stereotypical behavior of, the black guy and the Chinese guy and that sort of stuff. And I kind of thought that was crossing the line, and I remember sending Ken an email saying, generally speaking, looks like you did a good job, but there's a couple places where your liberties might be a little more than the world is ready to see.
So you're saying you think you held back compared to what people were willing to. I mean, did you find?
Not really. There was an element of. Shortly thereafter, I started doing the Frogger stuff and whatnot. So there was a period of a year or two where sort of rock star status, but I wasn't associated exclusively with that. I remember when Online picked it up, and then it went into Time magazine. My mother was aghast. She was like, "Oh no, everybody knows." But no, I think when people, when they actually went into it, Softporn, using that name and the general theme was very salacious and got people to buy it. But then when you come right down to it, it's a comedy as opposed to an erotic adventure. So
Well, Russell Meyer kind of.
it was a tongue-in-cheek fictional treatment of what it was like to be in your 20s guy in America, and the most of the experience, the embarrassment of going in and buying a condom, that's something that every guy goes through sooner or later. So to work that into the stories just sort of, just seemed natural. And it's to try and capture those sorts of experiences. As I said, some of it drew on experiences I'd had, and others, for lack of a better term, were sort of trying to bring to life urban legends.
Is there, now, do you remember the environment? What it was like out there? That's a really young company.
It was a young company. It was, they had grown from a couple storefronts in a strip mall to like the entire strip mall. And then, there's one that was accounting, another slot would be programming, another slot would be sales. Very much the family-run business, which, strong sense of community, but there was also all the, politics of, well, he got that job because he's connected this way, and so forth and so on. The people who were managing were not the sort of people the VCs would have liked, but they were just, down to earth, common sense, and that's how they pulled it off. The culture was very much work hard, play hard. Some of the best parties I remember of my life were out there. On the other hand, it was considered moving out there, and it just wasn't meant to be.
Well, when you look at what Sierra, but on the other hand, it's completely different than what.
Well, part of what disillusioned me about the game industry, and I think in a lot of ways it holds true today, although I don't really track it that much nowadays, but it became almost like the cosmetics industry, where 90% of a product's success is a function of positioning and marketing and all that sort of stuff. And literally a game was getting maybe 10 to 15% of the budget was going into designing the game, and the rest of it was going into all this other stuff, which just I didn't find interesting. But I think the other thing is you got to look at it, and ideas are a dime a dozen. It's pulling them off that's the challenge, and Ken, for better or worse, figured out how to get from here to there.
Yep. Yes, I see. I looked into. I looked.
I thought the ultimately having the graphics, it was a good idea, and that's we're visual creatures, so. But there was initially there was so much horsepower required for the graphics, and the way Ken and Roberta designed their first games was that there was this, it was more a maze and a puzzle than telling a story. So I thought that was kind of a step backward, but then as things evolved, the stories came back into all of it. So, and that's it's kind of like do you want to get your news from the newspaper or from the TV or off the web? It's who's to say which one's right?
So every year by the dozens.
Yep.
I don't know if you've interacted much with that.
I have, I somewhere around Yeah, it was probably about 1990 that early 90s, that the whole game thing just, I lost interest in it, so I don't see a whole lot of that nowadays. Of course, I during the 90s, pretty much was exclusively involved in military simulations, which are just video games with really big budgets.
Well, did you find any, was it a case of you were like...
And I don't recall that. I do remember there was sort of a struggle in how to come up with a puzzle that fit the storyline without, just being a puzzle for puzzle's sake. Yeah, here come the sirens.
I mean, you've got this, did you have friends who gave you ideas, or did you test them out with friends?
I had, I would, I was working full-time at the same time. So evenings I would have at the game, and then on weekends I'd bundle everything into the car and go drive, to friends and have them try it out and figure out what puzzles were too hard, what puzzles were easy, what things they thought were amusing, what they didn't like, and tweaked it based on that.
Well, if you ever saw that in action, where there was just a case...
I was getting a royalty stream off of it, and it was steadily declining. There also was, I know, in fact, there's a guy who I work with, current day, who used to work for Apple back then, was their Apple III product manager, but was involved in their educational stuff too. And I know one time Apple was unveiling some new educational stuff, and Sierra Online had provided one of the games, or was publishing one of the games, and they had this big press event, and the box comes in late, and they rip open the box, and there's Softporn Adventure adjacent to the educational game, and it was there was some uncomfortable quiet in the room from what I hear. Well, actually what happened, Al had been doing educational software for Sierra Online, or Online at the time, or I can't remember what their name was at that point. And there had always been discussion of someday we need to take Softporn and repackage it and do graphics, so forth and so on. Anyways, I got to a point where I decided enough's enough, don't want to do video games anymore, and had pretty much told Ken Williams that, don't call, I'm moving on to other things.
Right.
But Ken called me a year or so later and said, hey, we want to make a graphics version of Softporn. I can't remember how Al ended up being selected to do it. And then Ken offered me a 1% royalty, forevermore. Or I think it was a one-time payment of $5,000. And I'd had a struggling year, and I had a tax bill due, so I took the one-time payment, and I'd be sailing in the Caribbean if I had taken the 1%. So, but Al did I thought he did a good job on that first one. And the subsequent ones, I actually haven't played very many of them.
Because there's 8.
Yeah. And
it's enough of a franchise that it continues all the way through their buyout.
Yeah, and at some point, I have the original Apple computer I wrote it on, and all the original source code, so forth and so on, stashed. When I was selling it as Softporn Adventure, I'd had 1,000 brochures made up that are these blue, very primitive brochures, and I still have those sitting in my barn, and someday I figure I'll do a re-release or something like that.
Yep.
Donate it to a museum. And sometimes, I remember I sold the original Blue Sky Software version at an Apple Fest, and a kid, 10 or 11, wanted to buy it, and I'd said no, and his dad came back. His dad bought it. The next day, the kid shows up wanting his money back because he thought the game was too easy. He had solved it the night beforehand. And among other things, he couldn't understand why he had to wear a rubber because it wasn't raining out and his feet weren't going to get wet. He didn't need to wear rubbers. You know, so there's this edge of the puzzle thing that's like people just randomly typing in words and solving it. So, you know, it's
Well, there's
well, that was one of the reasons that I ended up licensing to Sierra or online was the friction being that
I mean, how did that manifest itself for you?
Oh, it was, you know, you go into the local computer store. Excuse me. You go into the local computer store, and you know people would ask for your autograph, and you know there'd be murmurings. You know, oh, that's the guy who did this over there, you know, I suddenly found myself much more interesting to women. So that was certainly a plus, and it was fun. Although it was also odd. I remember going to conventions out in San Francisco, and a bunch of us video game authors would be sitting around the table, and you know, some of them really had the rock star mentality, and you know that they make grand entrances and they have to be seen, and you know, I remember there's a guy who had no, no,
Yeah.
It
you
know, at the time that I went into it, it was still very much such a small community, and you know, then it just blossomed into this huge, you know, and then you know, magazine articles and that sort of stuff was.
Right.
It's, you know, you know, the Pixar style movies nowadays, you know, at some point, somewhere down the line, somebody's going to figure out the AI issues and whatnot to be able to take that movie and have it, you know, have an adventure component to it, but still be a full-blown production house quality experience.
Right. Don't mind me. I'm just going to shift him. No idea if he's what, you know, where that number.
I was I had a royalty stream off of that was auditable back to their sales department, and yeah, it was I can't remember. It had to have been, I'm thinking more on the 50 or 60,000. It was it's what made the down payment for my first house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
That actually puts you in a rare, your games were able to pay for your living.
What ended up happening was I was working as a field engineer for a flight simulator company, and after about 6 months of going to the mailbox and finding more money from my royalty stream than I was getting in my professional job, I said, there's something wrong here. And I went and prepaid my rent for 6 months because I wanted the security of that, which the landlord, she just dropped her jaw and said, nobody prepays for 6 months, and took the plunge.
Game, the second adventure game.
Yeah, there was I had looked at one point at doing just a follow-on to it as a text, rather as graphics. That never went anywhere, and then at one point there was an awful lot of interest in a female version of it.
Mm-hmm.
Although, you know, frankly, I found women enjoyed playing it as much as guys. In fact, we're a little bit better at it, a little more in tune. But at one point, we looked at doing a female version of it. But you know, I've tried to lure various female friends into sort of co-authoring it, but never found one who really brought it forward and made it happen. So it never came to be.
I mean, Roberta didn't take an interest in the property?
No.
Was she kind of a piece of the property, or said we could do something with this?
I think she had her plate full anyways with, you know, everybody wanted to see the next Roberta title. You know, and for her to pick up the thread that I'd introduced sort of diminished her star quality, and she was selling plenty of discs, so, you know,
Right.
why complicate things? Yeah, she, you know, there was an element of that she would do the games, but the business of online was something to let the other people do.
Right.
So.
So you
Yeah,
do
yeah.
this.
Yeah.
I don't know if you gave much thought to that, or if
I
that
was I followed the Scott Adams model, which you know, it's first person. You know, and you're walking around as opposed to standing behind and directing the little guy.
Did you,
And I think that's one of the things. One of the reasons that Softporn worked was that there was a deliberate knowledge that if you got people involved, they'd fill in the gaps themselves.
Right.
So you're sort of, you know, laying out a framework, which then they drape with lots more detail to flesh out the story, so to speak. So.
Did you ever meet?
So at that point,
Right.
you know, an awful lot of what was being done then was considered so groundbreaking, and by today's standards is considered so simple. I think at one point there was a text concept, and at another point there was a graph. Actually, now that I think of it, we were going to do a female text version, and Animal House came out somewhere around then, and was planning on doing a, you know, sort of in the same vein, a humorous parody of young 20s college life that would have, you know, all the partying and the sex stuff and whatnot.
Yep.
And that was the one that started but never finished.
Okay, that fills in a gap. I guess that's what.
Yeah. I had bought, well, I had personally bought an Apple II, you know, with 16K RAM and you used a little cassette player. And one of the first games I'd gotten was a Scott Adams adventure, which I thought that was pretty cool. And shortly thereafter, I talked my employer into getting an Apple at work. And being a field engineer, had to track, you know, parts that were out in the field and problems and so forth and so on. So I had to write a little database program that would manage all of that. And they had bought the Apple on my promise that I'd write it, but I didn't have the really the experience and had never been exposed to BASIC. So to teach myself programming in Apple in BASIC, I gave myself this initial thing of, well, I'll try making an adventure, but as the objects move around, I'll have to store them in different locations and you know, learn how to build linked lists and all that kind of stuff. So it was a good, there was a lot of analogy between an adventure game and the sort of application that I was going to have to write for my real job.
Right.
So anyways, I did that. The original game It had. It also had. There were drug dealers involved in it, and it was a little more not ready for mainstream America. But enough people, enough friends, were saying, "Oh, get me the next, bring it up next weekend too." That's when I said, "Hey, this is something that if I made a version that was ready for mainstream America, it could be sold." So that was when I jumped on and wrote it and came up with the name Softporn Adventure, which that name I think was 50% of the battle there, because it just. The play on software and working, and soft porn, it's not a hard porn adventure, just, intrigues people. It was a name that people said, I got to figure out what the heck this thing is.
Right. Yeah, the name really strikes me.
Well, at the time that soft porn adventure was coined as a name, it was, it was pirate adventure and island adventure, and it was, you had to say what it was that you were buying, and you had to do it in short enough that you could fit it on a little disc. So
Easy enough to.
Pretty much easy enough to solve. That was one of the things. If people were having that much trouble sorting it out, then it was, the idea is, 100 simple puzzles that add texture to the games better than one hard one. So.